Hey there everybody, it's Eternal Snowman here for part 2 of the Viability Rankings post UPL, and we are here doing the B plus to C minus Pokemon, and this is part 2, so if you missed part 1 and you're interested in checking it out, the link will be in the description below, or you can click the iCard in the top right corner for the link there, and we will be talking about all the Pokemon from B plus to A minus, and each one will be kind of brief, unlike the previous video where I went pretty in depth with all the top Pokemon, because these Pokemon generally only run one successful set or have a lot of crippling flaws as to why they aren't higher in the rankings, and I'll talk about what makes them successful and what flaws they have. So Arceus Dark has been rising in popularity a lot recently because of its ability as a support Arceus set to avoid Gothitelle, especially because it's a Pokemon that can check both Zygarde and not be trapped by Gothitelle, which is pretty rare in the current metagame. And this is relevant because Gothitelle Zygarde sets have been teams have been very, very strong recently. Or at least the threat of Gothitelle plus Zygarde stream teams have been very strong. Without actually having to bring Gothitelle, those Zygarde teams can abuse the fact that you don't want to bring Gothitelle weak Pokemon. So Arceus Dark has been something that has risen up in that. It also is notable because it can check Lunala, Mega Metagross, and a lot of these other Pokemon, and like Ultra Necrozma, for example, that other Pokemon that can't really do. However, Arceus Dark's biggest, also Yveltal, which is extremely notable. However, its biggest flaw is that it cannot beat Xerneas, and this is huge. As a support Arceus form with the inability to pressure Xerneas at all, pretty much it does like, I don't know, 20% on judgment on a switch in, which is essentially not touching it because Xerneas will do 20%, more than 20% to every single one of its defensive checks, right? So, it makes it really hard to be able to use in many cases because of its weakness. The weakness to Zern is so like hard to overcome. So this is its main flaw. Also, the fact that some of its mons can run it is often a primary Yveltal check on many teams. However, the fact that you can U-turn out of it makes it really hard to deal with, because if you switch in on the U-turn and then it goes to like a Xerneas, and then you're forced out with the Arceus Dark, then and then they go Yveltal again, and then they U-turn on the switch in again, then you're pretty much at a point where you can't really check Yveltal, right? So that's a weakness of Arceus Dark. However, it is very good in the current meta, and that's why it's at the top of B+, and can provide a good role for many teams. Mega Venusaur is pretty much my baby. Pretty much the Pokemon that I have brought to relevance in Ubers, or at least I think I've brought to relevance in Ubers, and I believe it's a lot better than most people do. Obviously, I'm biased, but I do think it is quite good and one of the best balanced megas in the current meta. As for why I believe this, it is because Mega Venusaur provides a amazing check to a lot of the common Pokemon in the metagame, including stuff like Arceus Ground, defensive Primal Groudon, Xerneas, all sets of Xerneas, non-CM forms of Primal Kyogre, other stuff like Arceus Fairy. It can be a soft check to stuff like Marshadow, Giratina Origin, and a lot of these other Pokemon, and it's very easy to fit into defensive cores alongside stuff like Arceus Ground, as the two of them can be a good portion of the meta just like within that. It's also notable because it can run a variety of fourth moves to be able to be whatever it needs to, or like not lose to whatever it needs to for those teams. For example, you can run Roar to make sure that you don't lose to Duskman. You can run Toxic to offensively pressure, or like to status pressure a lot of Pokemon. You can run Knockoff to beat Ferrothorn pretty easily, because it then denies any sort of healing from Ferrothorn. And then Mega Venusaur is also notable for being a toxic immunity and its ability for Leech Seed to help versus stall. Since a lot of stall breakers like Eviltal, like Primal Kyogre, like mixed Primal Kyogre, may be very, very good against stall, except for the fact that they can be chipped. And if they take a lot of toxic chip, then it is like a way that they do lose to stall. So Mega Venusaur, when paired with these Pokemon, if you Leech Seed, for example, you go in and you Leech Seed a Ho-Oh, then you can provide healing to some of your teammates. And that is very good in many cases, especially for healing Primal Groudon, Mixed Ogre, and Yveltal are the notable ones. Mega Venusaur, main weakness is the fact that it can be pressured by a lot of stuff. The notable ones that it really does limit it in the current meta are Duskmane, and that is like the huge one. Other stuff like Eviltal, offensive Groudon, Megaments, and Rayquaza are all there, but they generally are not as big of an issue as Duskmane, and you can generally bypass most of those checks with Toxic, except Duskmane, which is the problem Pokemon for Mega Venusaur. As for, and that's why it's rated this low or like that's what prevents it from going higher, pretty much. Megaments, which I know it's weird that I rated Mega Venusaur above Megaments, but hear me out. I believe Megaments is a Pokemon, while it's very good, is a lot worse in the current metagame. It can be very easily taken advantage of in many cases, being a bait for Duskmane in many cases. It is also bait for Zygarde in many cases as well. And it's just not as strong as it used to be, with a lot of teams just being able to bypass it very easily. And it has a lot of the problems that Zygarde C has. However, in the sense that its weaknesses or its strength is its physical bulk, but its weakness is its special bulk, in especially Ice Dragon and Fairy. However, it's not as strong as Zygarde in terms of like sweeping potential, or like in just raw strength, it's a lot stronger than Zygarde be. But in sweeping potential, it's actually a lot lower because it doesn't have the same bulk, and it doesn't have the same effect with its monostab. And Thousand Arrows is a lot better than Double Edge, or Aerialate Double Edge, or Aerialate Facade, or whatever it is. In the sense that a lot of Pokemon have been running HP Ice, a lot of Ice Beam, a lot of Pokemon that need to check Zygarde also check Megaments pretty easily. So it's not that good in the current meta. I don't think the fact that it takes a Mega slot is too much of a knock on it anymore, because Megas have, for the most part, been kind of a lot worse recently. I think the most prominent Megas generally that would fit onto a team with Megaments, like so a slot where Megaments could potentially fit into, the ones that could potentially take its slot is Mega Lucario on offense, which is the only other offensive Mega that you can actually realistically run on offense. Maybe Gengar, but Gengar is kind of shaky on offense in my opinion because it's kind of hard to set up. And then on balance, it's like Gengar, Venusaur, and like maybe Sableye and like maybe Scizor, but like those Pokemon are like hard to fit on teams. Oh, also Mega DNC on offense, so it's like it doesn't really have that much competition for offense, like for whatever slots it's going to be used for. So like Mega Salamence doesn't. I don't think running it, the fact that it's a Mega really goes against it, but there are other things that do go against it. Arceus Flying, another flying Pokemon. This Pokemon is very good against teams that really just don't run a lot of physical threats. Its CM set can be really punishing. It is a lot worse because of Duskmane being so prevalent in the current meta. It is a Duskmane fodder Pokemon, but it is still very strong because it bypasses a lot of defensive teams that don't run solid checks to stuff, where you just run Toxic to check stuff. I've also seen teams that, or like I've also seen Arceus Flying being run with Wisp instead of Refresh, which can be decent for checking, like being a bait for Duskmane and that kind of stuff. It is very good in the current meta for what it does, which is being a late game win con that is immune to hazards, as well as just having a generally decent defensive typing actually for the Ubers tier, because not many Pokemon run Rock and Electric type moves. So it provides actually like a decent late game win con. Its weakness is that it can't is Duskmane for the most part. Pretty much a lot of these Pokemon are limited by 1 or 2 Pokemon in the very, very top tiers. For example, Arceus Dark being limited by Xerneas, Mega Venusaur by Duskmane, Mega Salamence, I think, by a combination of Duskmane as well as other metagame trends like uh, Zygarde and Scarfazern being more popular and that kind of stuff. Arceus Flying by Duskmane. Lugia, which is the next Pokemon, also by Duskmane. It is Duskmane bait for sure. Pretty much the only thing it can do is just phase it out, and that's not really a good check because Lugia has to be run on stall, and it's hard to win the Hazard War on stall, so there's that. Lugia is good for what it does on stall. It checks a lot of stuff, mainly Primal Groudon. It can provide a secondary check to a lot of stuff. You have to run Detail if you don't want to be weak to Goth, but at least it has the option to do that, where some other Pokemon don't. So Lugia is still decent. It can phase stuff. It can be really fat, and it can Toxic. So it can be a very good Mon that can smash a lot of HO teams. However, once again, the reason why it's not higher, Duskmane, Duskmane, Duskmane. Also, Yveltal is like a thing that can really pressure it and a lot of other stall teams, but that's like not really a knock on it because I think most stall mons lose to that anyway. Um, and also that at least you can pressure Yveltal with Toxic and that kind of stuff. But Lugia still is very good for what it does because it does check a lot of blanket checks a lot of stuff for stall, which is pretty important. But it is also not as good as it was because of Duskman. Smeargle, I think, is something. I think this is kind of. I'm only ranking it this high because of how successful the playstyle it enables is. So Smeargle enables Web's offense, and I think it's recently it has been very, very hard to stop Sneasel from setting up Webs. What the only way to really do it is you have to either run stuff like Double Kick Terrakion, which is like essentially like a niche that doesn't is specifically for anti-leading Smeargle, or you have to do stuff like Taunt or with like Yveltal. But then Taunt with Yveltal isn't really that good because Smeargle can nuzzle you, and then that cripples your Yveltal, which Yveltal is very good against webs. So you're losing the ability to set up webs. You're losing one of the big boons for webs, and then if they correctly predict that, and then they can later switch in Smeargle to then get webs up again. So, and then webs teams are very good at preventing you from defogging, since they either will punish your defog really hard or they will just prevent you from defogging with time. So I think webs has been very good recently with stuff like Lunala webs being very popular, as well as other teams that can run webs very well, like Ultra Necrozma webs. Ultra Necrozma and Lunala being some enablers for webs that has made this playstyle very successful. It's also notable that a lot of teams also run stuff like Mega Lucario too on webs. And that's why Smeargle is so high, is because it's an enabler for a playstyle that has been very successful recently. Mega Lucario is another Pokemon that you can really see only on offense, and in many cases it's seen on webs offense. However, it can also be just seen on normal offense as a very strong balance breaker. I see it kind of as a counterpart to Marshadow, in the sense that Mega Lucario is very good at stopping a lot of balance teams, as opposed to the Marshadow that's very good against offense teams. And the reason why Mega Lucario can be so successful is because its sheer power is so high. It's also notable because of its ability to run Bullet Punch. It can then be used as a secondary check or like a check priority check stuff like Xerneas. I think one of the reasons why it's not as good as it was before is because in in my opinion, I think it's slot on pressure offense than most people would have run it in its place before. I think Mega Metagross is better now in that slot because of its ability to actually bypass its checks, where Mega Lucario is very binary in the fact that it cannot bypass a lot of its checks, like RCS Ground and that kind of stuff. However, and also it's notable that stuff like Zygarde Complete being pretty popular, as well as it doesn't provide much defensive utility which is important for a lot of offensive teams now too, makes it lose kind of its slot. Mega Sableye, another Pokemon I'm putting up here because of its prevalence on stall. It's good at what it does, which is it prevents hazards from like very offensive teams. In many cases, though, well, not many, but like now it's only like a 50-50 on stall. I don't think any Pokemon is a shoe-in for stall anymore, as each stall team can run. I think there's like 15 or so different viable stall mons, and you can kind of like interchange them based on what you need. Mega Sableye can definitely not there definitely can be stall teams that are successful without Mega Sableye. In fact, they run Mega Gengar as their primary Mega, but Sableye is still good for what it does. It checks E-Killer, it checks blanket checks a lot of different stuff like the can blanket check kind of stuff like Lucario, and the fact that it can prevent hazards is pretty good. RCS Ghost, not as good in the current meta as it used to be. However, it is a option on webs. It is also an option to pair with stuff like Irritant Origin and Marshadow to be able to defensively pressure some cores where because it's able to bypass a lot of Evoltal sets if you run different stuff like CM Ice Beam, for example, can bypass Evoltal pretty easily. However, it's not as good as it used to be. It still has a lot of checks to common stuff still check it, like Arceus Dark, Arceus, or like Evoltal, and if it's running offensive sets like different, or like if it's running CM, then Ho-Oh and Ferrothorn. If it's running like it's SD set, then stuff like Zygarde and Evoltal and even Xerneas can be a secondary check to that kind of stuff. Tyranitar is next. Tyranitar is one of my favorite Pokemon in Ubers because of its ability to be a defensive pressure and also pursuit trap a lot of different threats like Lunala, like the Lunala, like the Gothitelle and that kind of stuff. It can run like its primary purpose is pursuit trapping, and it can run variations on this. So an example of this would be CB, which would be a lot of choice band, which would be a lot of ways to pressure Pokemon outside of just pursuit trapping and putting dents and stuff because dark resists are not that common in Ubers. Like there's Evoltal checks, which is like pretty much just like Xerneas and stuff. So choice band can be a way to pressure these teams really heavily, or you can run stuff like Lumberry or Resist Berry on T-Tar to check specific threats. Lumberry is better for pursuit trapping Mega Gengar, for example, while like Resist Berry can allow it to check stuff like Arceus Ground, like for example Shucka Berry, you can use it to check SD Arceus Ground with Foul Play, or you can run Shucka Berry to beat E-Killer with Foul Play or something like that. And it allows it to be able to do different things, and in this way it's kind of flexible for a team to use it because it can be like a one-time check for a lot of different Pokemon, as well as being a decent offensive pressure, and also has the ability to set rocks. However, it's not really a good primary rock setter because it's hard for it to find opportunities to rocks since you would rather be clicking other moves when it's in a lot of the time. At least normal Tyranitar. I would say Mega Tyranitar is a little bit different. Magearna is this slow, I would say. This low. I'm pretty much just basing where I think most people would rank them on based on where the viability rankings would rank them on, as well as like different people I've talked to. Magearna is this low because I think it's one of the mons that struggles a lot from the meta being very offensive. I also think it's very it's not I think, but it is a very passive mon, and I think it's really bad for being a passive mon, with it being able to be exploited by a lot of common mons, namely Primal Groudon. And it has to give up something, like depending on what it runs, it has like 5 moves it really wants to run, and it has to give up one of them like in some way. So it's either it's Volt Switch, Flare Cannon, Heart Swap, Pain Split, and Heal Bow. And you want to run all 5 of these moves, but you can't really. You have to give up one of them.
and giving up one. Normally, it would be either pain split or heal bell. Um, provides like it's a lot less useful because the reason or like heal bell is so makes it a lot more useful, and like in the case that you get free turns, you can actually use those free turns. um, whereas paint split actually gives it survivability, but in both cases it is still very passive in the sense that it's free setup for like stuff like Primal Groudon and that kind of stuff. I've also seen people speculate about Specs Magirna. However, one of the and like say it's like really good because its ability to pressure Primal Groudon, which is in part true. However, at the same time, it's also more easily pressured by stuff like the things that it needs to check, like Xerneas and Yveltal. And also, like, the fact that Flare Cannon is not as good as Mid Blast is pretty worrying. Um, so, Magearna, all in all, passive Mon can do what it can do pretty well, but it is can be easily pressured and has issues with that. Dialga is next. I think it's the best offensive rock setter. Oh, no, not the best. One of the best offensive rock setters in the game, and it is also the least limiting and easiest to fit onto a team. I'll kind of go through a little bit of what I mean. Uh, with that, Dialga is ranked a lot higher here than it would be on the viability rankings because, okay, Dialga's main boon is setting stealth rocks, and then it can also check stuff like one time or whatever, and it's also very good at pressuring stall. So why is it able to do these things? First off, it's like the fact that it sets rocks is important because the other two primary rock setters or like other primary rock setters are Primal Groudon and Primal Groudon, kind of Necrozma, and also uh, different Arceus forms. So you generally don't want okay, if you're running a team that doesn't want to run SR Arceus and you want to free up your Primal Groudon slot to run some sort of offensive set, then Dialga can be your chosen choice. It's also notable because it's a toxic immune, which makes it very strong versus stall, and it can pressure stall with different sets. It's it has one primary set, which is its um, Stealth Rock set, but you can run different variations of it to be able to beat different stuff, like Thunder, like Stone Edge, on that set, and also Adamant Orb versus Shuckaberry. Shuckaberry can provide a lot of defensive utility, while Adamant Orb can allow it to pressure stall really, really heavily and make it really threatening, along with Toxic and stuff like that. So Dialga, pretty good offensive setter. Mega DNC is next. It's a very good mon versus stall for offensive teams, um, but it also suffers from the fact that it is not as fast as it wants to be. And while it is a strong fairy type, it does have a lot of defensive issues because it's weak to steel, it's weak to just like a bunch of common stuff, it's weak to ground, but it is one of the better mons for pressure, offense, and just like offense in general because of its ability to keep off hazards as well as just deal out a lot of damage because of its high offenses. Um, and it's a notable counter to Mega Sableye, and its Rock Fairy typing allows it to really hit stall really hard since they don't really run that many Rock Fairy resists. But while it is good versus stall and it is good versus bulkier teams, it does struggle versus offense, especially mons that like teams that run Scarf Xerneas and that kind of stuff because it's unable to really bypass stuff that is faster than it. Stuff like Arceus Ground, Scarf Xerneas, even slower stuff that is especially bulky, or like just bulky in general, like Primal Groudon, uh, like um, Primal Kyogre, but DNC can offensively pressure a lot of mons that don't have the like if you run with like a certain team comp, then it can offensively pressure these fairy resists because there's access to earth power as well as diamond storm, making it a pretty good offensive mon with not that much defensive utility. It's also notable because it uh, it can offensively pressure Duskmane, but it is also weak to Duskmane, being a fairy type and 4 times weak to steel and all. Blissey is next on this list. Very good special blanket check for stall.
Not too much to say about it. It runs Confide. It's kind of uh it can be set up, or like it's kind of passive because it doesn't really run many offensive moves. That at most it runs Toxic and Confide, which are like it's two ways to prevent setup really. Um it's pretty easy to be taken advantage of, but it is still very good because it's probably the one of the best heal bellers on stall, and its ability to check stuff like Xerneas, non knockoff evil talls, stuff like that, stuff like Primal Kyogre, CM, RCS, and that kind of stuff makes Blissey pretty good at what it does. It's also notable to be better than Chansey because its access to Shed Shell means it can't be trapped by stuff like Gengar and Gothitelle, which is pretty good for stall, and that's why it is the primary choice for stall over Chansey nowadays. Celesteela is next. It's dropped a lot since its heyday in SM, and it is still good. I think it's a niche pick in a lot of circumstances that can take over games because, much like Ferrothorn, it's very hard to kill. While it doesn't provide the same hazards that Ferrothorn does, it's a lot harder to kill because it doesn't have a 4x weakness on fire, and it only really has two weaknesses. It has two weaknesses, and one of them aren't really used in Ubers, which is Electric. Electric is a pretty uncommon typing. Fire, while common, is can be avoided, and Celesteela is then able to check a lot of stuff like E-Killer, Mega Mewtwo, Mega Tyranitar, just looking at this list. Or just Blake can check a lot of stuff um, like Dialga and Mega Lucario to an extent, kind of. Um, like Megaments, Zygarde, kind of, not really. And the reason why current metagame trends are really working against it are like a lot of common sweepers are running stuff like sub or similar stuff, and like the fact that it's a Dusk main slash Zern like it's a steel and slash fairy resist that can't really check either really reliably because Duskmane just sets up in its face and then Z moves the Celesteela and then it dies, which is hilarious because that's stupid as hell, but it's also like the reason why it's not as good anymore. Uh, Mega Mewtwo Y is a Pokemon that has been rising up in as of late. It's very good because of its ability to beat support RCS forms. And it can pressure a lot of offensive teams because of its insanely high speed tier. CM is probably its main set, but it can also run Taunt plus other stuff as a way to prevent hazards from going down on offense. It is a Pokemon that pretty much only appears on offense, and while it's not a popular pick right now, it does have the potential to rise up and be very wait oh shit I realized I didn't include E-Killer on this list. Well, that is awkward. Well, I might as well talk about. I'll finish talking about Mega Mewtwo Y, but its main weakness is its lack of physical bulk, making it very susceptible to stuff like Primal Groudon, stuff like Marshadow, stuff like just like things that can hit it physically at like pretty much can hit it physically, relatively strong, and it can easily be like taken down from there because its physical bulk is pretty mediocre. But it's able to offensive pressure a bunch of stuff, and it can choose its different coverage based on like the situation that you need it to be successful in. So generally, well, okay, it has to run Psystrike pretty much, and then the other moves can all be filler. It can run Taunt, CM, Fire Blast, Ice Beam, even stuff like Focus Blast and like Thunderbolt can be niche options if you need it. Mega Tyranitar is up next, and it's rated under Tyranitar because it doesn't have as much flexibility. It really runs only one set, and it's relatively successful at the set. It's a defensive Stealth Rock set. It can be used to Pursuit Trap a lot of stuff. However, it fears Will-O-Wisp from Gengar and stuff like that. But Mega Tyranitar is still good at what it does, which is essentially pressure or like provide rocks and pursuit trap the different things, and it can also defensively check a lot of different threats such as E-Killer such as Arceus Ghost, Lunala, and stuff like that, as well as being able to eliminate Gothitelle and that kind of stuff. It is when I first when it first got released, it was released like a month before March Shadow. I actually believe that it was considered like it would have been like an A tier to A plus tier mon, because of how good it was in that meta. But with the release of Marshadow, with the release of Duskmane, and all these other stuff, it loses a lot of its value because it has so many checks now that have been introduced, and it doesn't check as much stuff. And the value of a Ghost Resist has dropped significantly since that point in SM. So while it is still good, Ghost Resists are not as good as they were before, and that's about it for Mega Tyranitar. Cloyster, another mon that is rated higher because of its ability to enable. Oh, okay. Actually, I want to talk about E-Killer. I would rate E-Killer probably an A minus or maybe B plus. I'll just say I would rate it in B plus right here above Arceus Dark. I think E-Killer is really good in this current meta. Really good in this current, a lot better than people would expect in this current meta, I should say, because people are saying that E-Killer has pretty much lost its viability since the introduction of Marshadow. However, it has gained a lot of traction recently because of the fact that there is a style of offense where you pretty much just threat stack. As many checks to E-Killer also are checks for Duskmane and Primal Groudon, so if you pressure them down with E-Killer, then it is easy for you to actually be able to like threaten these checks and stuff like that, and actually get sweeps with other Pokemon. Either they like the Duskmane sets up first, and then the check is weakened, and then E-Killer comes in, and then it sets up, and then there isn't a primary check to it anymore, and that kind of stuff. That can happen in a lot of games, especially because E-Killer is not being prepped for as much as of late. However, because of the fact that it has all the answers in the metagame, it doesn't have a lot of room to go up because as it gets more popular, people will answer and then it will go back down to being less popular because it will not be as successful because of that, like more people are running answers to it. So Cloyster. Cloyster is has been used a lot recently. I'll talk about Cloyster and Toxapex together because they really enable one type of playstyle, which is T-Spikes. And I was talking about Zygarde. When I was talking about Zygarde earlier, I said that one of the reasons why Zygarde is held up from the S tier is the fact that you have to run it alongside suboptimal Pokemon. One is the Glare set, which is, while it's good, is not like it relies on RNG. The T Spikes support for Zygarde is the one of the like strongest ways to enable Zygarde because Sub Protect plus DD allows it to bypass many of its primary checks, and it's very dangerous. However, T-Spikes, the two common Pokemon that can run it are Toxapex and Cloyster. They each have their own problems. Cloyster being an HO lead means that you have to somehow prevent Defog from going down, or like from T-Spikes from like keep T-Spikes up the entire game, which is insanely hard because first off, hazard removal is really prevalent in the current meta, and also because T-Spikes is something that can be removed from just poison type switching. And granted, there's not that many poison types in the meta, which it's like Arceus Poison and then Mega Venusaur, but and Toxapex, but it can be hard to keep it up as Cloyster on Cloyster teams. But if you can manage to keep them up, then it is dangerous for opposing teams that use different checks as their primary answer to Zygarde. Cloyster by itself is not that good of a Pokemon. It's pretty much just to enable Zygarde in T-Spikes, and same with Toxapex. And the reason why, Toxapex's problem is that even though it does have the survivability and it can actually do stuff other than setting T-Spikes, where Cloyster can't really, it's literally just to set T-Spikes and then prevent them from being spun, or prevent them from being cleared in whatever way with Shell Smash and that kind of stuff. Toxapex's issue is that it can't really set up T-Specs on a lot of the meta because its weakness to ground holds it back, and it's also kind of, I wouldn't say it's frail, but it's not as bulky as you would expect for what it needs to do because it can't switch into a lot of different stuff. It's also notably a Xerneas fairy resist that also loses to Xerneas. I'll bring this up every time because um, the reason why it's hard to run these Pokemon that are, or like hard to justify running these Pokemon that are fairy resist but don't actually beat Geozern is because they often lose to Primal Ground, and you can't afford to run multiple slots that lose to both, to lose to Primal Ground, or run multiple slots that run lose to Geozern. So as an example, it's like you can run Ho-Oh, and if you run Ho-Oh and Ferrothorn, you actually don't have a primary Xerneas check in there because both of those Pokemon lose to the Thunder Focus Blast Geo set, which is pretty much the standard set, is what I'm going to say. And so if um, you're running a team that can't really beat Geozern, but you're already running two Pokemon that lose to Primal Groudon. So running a third one like Magearna, Aegislash, like um, Primal Groudon, it makes it really hard because then Primal Groudon becomes a huge issue, right? So that's why Pokemon like Toxapex or like Fairy Resists that aren't able to beat Geozern are kind of problematic. Deoxys attack takes up the next slot. This Pokemon has lost a lot of prevalence since its heyday in ORAS, or even like you can go back even further than that. But its problem is mainly that it doesn't really have any defense. Okay, kind of talked about this before when talking about some other Pokemon, but it has no defensive utility. Um, unlike Mega Lucario, who is another Pokemon that I talked about that doesn't really have much defensive utility, Deoxys attack actually has none because at least Mega Lucario you can absorb a toxic hit, like it's a static or like a toxic immune. Deoxys attack literally has nothing for it, so it's extremely weak defense, or like it has no defensive utility. And while its offensive pressure is good, it has a lot of off checks, defensive checks. Like it's not hard to defensively check it. With a lot of teams running a bunch of different stuff to be able to stop it. It's notable for being a spike setter, or like X hazard setter. Normally, you run it on spikes on offense, and can do different stuff even though it has offensive checks. So Deoxys attack, while it is not bad, uh, it has lost a lot of its prowess since it was good. I should say that, put it that way. Its main boon is against like pressure offense, where a lot of mons don't really have the speed to contest it and hit it, and then it can hit KO them in return before they hit it. Giratina Origin, or sorry, Giratina Alternate Form, or Giratina A is a mon that pretty much only appears on stall, and its main boon is pretty much just to check Primal Groudon and prevent Primal Groudon from setting up hazards. And while it's very good at doing that, I do think that stall has been on the decline recently, especially Giratina is not necessarily a must-have on stall either, because you can run Ho-Oh as a answer to Primal Groudon, since they normally don't run Rock Stab on um, defensive rocks. So Giratina isn't necessarily a necessity for a lot of teams, stall teams, and it's also weak to Xerneas and Yveltal again, like its other form. And this is even compounded, like this. That's a lot worse for stall because Yveltal is something that is so threatening for stall. So you can't really have a lot of Pokemon that can just be a free switch in or like easily pressured by stall. Mega Gyarados is rated here pretty much alongside all the stall mons because I think its viability comes and goes where stall goes. So much like it's around the same as Giratina, Blissey, and Mega Sableye, who are like the stall enablers because it is a stall killer. So whenever stall is good, Mega Gyarados is good, and whenever stall is bad, Mega Gyarados is bad. It's pretty much only useful for beating stall, as its use on in other situations is very limited. It does find setup opportunities on like offensive, like against offense. However, its inability to kill like common offensive mons reliably, like Primal Groudon if you're not running Earthquake, like Xerneas, like Yveltal, makes it kind of lackluster, and in that sense, it doesn't really do as well as you would want it to. Aegislash is here as a primary Zern check. This is a very good Zern check. Checks every single Zern set as well as beating some support CS sets. However, it's this low, and it's a pretty good mon to use on balance. But however, it's this low because it provides a it's offensively pressured pretty easily by stuff like Yveltal, stuff like Giratina Origin, stuff like Primal Groudon, and it's not really a answer to Duskmane either, which is a problem. However, it can at least at least offensively pressure Duskmane a little bit, and it's also a Pokemon that isn't trapped by Gothitelle, which is pretty notable. Its Shadow Ball is pretty strong, so that's something that goes for it. However, you really need to play well with the Mon because King Shield can be taken advantage of because you're giving free turns intermittently, and so if you don't play well with the Mon, it can be easily taken advantage of. Deoxys Speed, I think it is ranked this low because as opposed to other hazard setters, it has been as of late outclassed. The other two ones that are ranked ahead of it are Smeargle and Cloyster, and they enable different types of playstyles, which are T-Spikes and Webs. But Standard HO has been kind of mediocre because that type of team loses to Marsh Headed pretty easily, and Deoxys Speed isn't necessarily like while an enabler for that style is not as good as the other two HO styles of Webs and T-Spikes, and it's often been at least for me, I feel like pressure offense where the rocker isn't a suicide lead can often be just as good as these HO styles and improve matchups on different categories while not really losing as many matchups. So Deoxys Speed I don't feel like is that good. Standard HO is still like around. I think it has its place in the metagame, and Deoxys Speed is the enabler for that in general. But because of the fact that it's not as good in this current meta, Deoxys Speed has been rated lower. Tapu Koko is enabler for Koko Zekrom. Koko Zek is a anti-stall style. It's also good in other balanced teams as a anti-hazard setter, anti-offense mon, as well as being pretty good against stall, and can use its Z move, Z Nature's Madness, to eliminate, pretty much take one Pokemon out of the game. Tapu Koko's weaknesses are the fact that it's kind of passive outside of the Z move, and can then lead to setup opportunities. It's also notable for blocking Rest, which can be used in some situations. And it's also bait for Zygarde, which is actually pretty big, and that's why it's rated so low. Excadrill kind of falls in the same category as Deoxys Speed because they both are offensive, or like they're enablers for hyper offense, and like that style of hyper offense. So I won't talk too much on Excadrill. Mega Scizor, a Pokemon that's pretty good at what it does, which is a defensive pivot. However, it's also very passive. It's also a Xerneas check that can lose to different Xerneas sets if it's running HP Fire, which is kind of dangerous. Like an example of why it's rated lower than Aegislash, despite the fact that it does have the presence to be able to do the same thing as Aegislash, but with U-turn, is that it is susceptible to HP Fire, which is notable. It's also like a mon that's easily pressured because it doesn't really have passive recovery, and the fact that you have to roost is actually like kind of a knock against it. Even though other Pokemon that do the same role, like Magearna and Aegislash, don't have passive recovery or don't have an actual roost like Mega Scizor, it's kind of a momentum sink to use it because Mega Scizor, in fact, it loses to so many common Pokemon in the metagame, and like depending on what type of moveset you're running, you actually lose to different sets. So for example, if you're not running Toxic, you can't offensively pressure a lot of these Pokemon that would just get free switch-ins to it. And if you're not running like Swords Dance for example, or that kind of stuff, then it can't actually beat like certain sets, which is notable. Naganadel is a Pokemon that has been rising up, and I think it has a lot of potential. However, I rate it this low because I haven't really seen anyone be successful with this Pokemon yet. I think it does have potential on pressure offense and as like a potential sweeper with Nasty Paw and its boosting speed. And if you play badly against it, it definitely has a possibility to sweep you. However, it finds very little opportunities to set up, and that's the main problem with it. It pretty much has to use predicted switches to set up because it really doesn't set up against anything except for like Arceus Water. That is a relevant Pokemon because every single Pokemon can literally just click its stab against it and then it will die to like almost anything. And so because of this, it doesn't really have a lot of value, and also it relies heavily on the Z move, and because of that, it can't really be used on a lot of teams because they would rather have another Z move user, since Naganadel can't really run any other non Z move sweeping set. So while it does have potential, and it definitely can be used, and it is scary for certain teams to deal with, it just doesn't have the same like there are other Pokemon that can be used to do similar jobs to it without having like the defensive issues. But it has a really good offensive repertoire. I would say it's pretty comparable to something like Mega Lucario. It's faster and can sweep, but it doesn't find itself as many setup opportunities. Since Lucario actually has a better defensive typing and stuff like that. And also doesn't have priority, which is important. Tapu Lele, a enabler for a playstyle that has been kind of dead recently, which is Psy Surge offense, or like Psychic Terrain offense, or Psy Spam. The other Pokemon on Psy Spam that would have been run on Psy Spam, like Ultra Necrozma and Mega Mewtwo Y, actually find themselves placed on teams without the need of Lele. And while it can be good, it's more of a C style for different other types of offense, since those teams rely heavily on priority to function. Lele can block those priority, and it's pretty much only good as an enabler. Its ability is the only reason you would run it, as it is kind of it's very frail and not very fast, and it's not that strong. So it does have a lot of issues outside of the fact that it can set terrain. Zekrom, I pretty much talked about Koko Zekrom before. It's ranked lower than Koko because Koko has uses outside of Koko's Zek core. Zekrom doesn't really. It's good against stall. It can be good against balance. If you run Scarf, it can do decent versus HO. Problem is that it can't. It's like its main problem is that it has common immunities in the metagame. Shit, sorry. Arceus Rock is a good Pokemon at certain things. However, it fluctuates with the meta, and right now the meta is really, really bad for it. It's at the worst place it has been in a long time, in my opinion, because it does not really check a lot of the Pokemon that it used to be good at checking. So while it checks Rayquaza and Ho-Oh and Mega Mence and stuff, those Pokemon have lost a lot of viability. And in large part, that is because of and it still loses to stuff like Primal Groudon and well, it still checks Yveltal, which is a relevant Pokemon, but still loses to stuff like Primal Groudon and Dust. It loses stuff Primal Groudon and Primal Kyogre, as well as losing to stuff like Duskmane and Zygarde that have been rising up recently. And because of that, it hasn't been as good as it used to be, because of the current metagame trends. It also is like a support Arceus form that loses to Gothitelle, so it doesn't really have as much, like it doesn't have as much over other support Arceus forms as it used to. Being a strong flying resist doesn't mean that much anymore. So it's at like one of its lowest points it's been in a while. Arceus Poison is a Pokemon that is a primary Xerneas check. It's very good at doing what it does. However, it also has a lot of very defined weaknesses.
which is it cannot beat Duskmane very easily. It cannot beat Primal Groudon very easily, and depending on what kind of coverage move you choose, like for example, if you choose Poison Jab Earthquake, in an attempt to like cover both of those, it's like kind of weak, so it doesn't really do that much. So while it does what it does fine, but it's also not very good at doing like stuff outside of its role. And its main weakness is of course Duskmane, and that's what's keeping it. And current metagame trends are also against it because stuff like Zygarde has been getting more popular, and Zygarde is a big problem for Arceus Poison, as well as Primal Groudon and Duskmane. Mega Lopunny, a Pokemon that can pair well with T-Spike's offense. It is a good pressure offensive tool and can abuse a lot of defensive backbones because of its use of Encore and just like a lot of chip damage with Fake Out, and can use its teammates Toxic to its advantage by using just like with Fake Out to get a lot of chip down. Mega Lopunny is also really fast, so it can take advantage of offensive teams that aren't really running a lot of speed control, because it's actually like it's strong enough to abuse offense with some hazards, but it's not really strong enough to like abuse. Like it can't be run on balance. It's pretty much just an offensive mon. Its main problems are that it's not as strong as it wants to be because it can't actually break defensive RCS form or like support CS without Encore help, and that's kind of a problem. And it's also like not very bulky, and it has common weaknesses to stuff like Zern, Yveltal. Can't really touch stuff like Zygarde, and it doesn't do enough to things like Primal Groudon as it wants to, like offensive Primal Groudon. Defensive Primal Groudon does good enough damage to actual pressure, but offensive forms it cannot pressure hard enough. And we're finally moving into the C rank. So in everything in B rank is pretty much limited to essentially that it's limited by one or two Pokemon in the higher tiers to really be super successful, or they have like a few crippling flaws. And in the C rank, you pretty much only use these Pokemon for specific niches that only they can fulfill, but they often um, can feel underwhelming in what they do and what like different things that like go on because they have so defined big weaknesses. So Ditto is one of the Pokemon that has been seeing some use on offense recently. It's prior to that has been a uh, like a some like has seen some usage on stall. Ditto stall is notably good against stuff like Restock, Primal Kyogre, and other teams that really, or and different offense teams that really lose to setup mons. But in offense, you pretty much use the same thing. However, Ditto it has a problem because what it wants to switch in on, many times it cannot switch directly in on, and it also because you have to run a choice scarf, it can be taken advantage of because after they see what move you click, then it like you can't really change that, right? So there's that. And there's also the case that Ditto can't always beat the stuff that it copies because its lower base HP actually means that it will take a lot more damage in the Ditto, especially in a tier like Uber's where the HP pools are really high. So while Ditto can be a niche mon on both offense and stall, it doesn't really see enough usage or like success, in my opinion, to actually warrant it being higher. However, I do think that it can be a nice niche option to surprise some like teams that aren't prepared for it. And similar to that is Arceus Ice, where it's very successful. I think it has a pretty successful offensive rocker set, but can be taken advantage of because of its lack of defensive utility and weakness to rocks and that kind of stuff. While it's good offensively, it's not always strong enough to break through everything by itself, and it's relying on its Z move or just like getting a good matchup to actually both set up rocks and get kills and stuff like that. It's cool for what it does, but it has a lot of problems. Mega Swampert is another Pokemon, very, very good against Stall because for some reason Stall is just really bad against strong ground types that can have reliable recovery. Oh shoot, bless you. Bless me. Shit. Sorry. And Mega Swampert is good at what it does for beating stall and can be a decent check to a bunch of stuff on balance. Like it can be a decent check to Necroz Duskmane. It can be a one-time check to stuff like Zygarde, to stuff like Mega Ments, to stuff like Primal Groudon. And Mega Swampert is essentially just a niche mon. It also beats stuff like Arceus Ground and that kind of stuff. So it's not bad for what it does, but it's definitely not for every team. Also takes the Mega slot where you can generally slot in something that can slot something else for your team as well. Palkia is a decent sweeper on stuff like webs or just pressure offense where it can use its Z move. Once again, it's a Pokemon that wants to use a Z move, and not all sweepers are able to have that liberty. So it falls into a similar category as Naganadel, but it's a little bit worse because it doesn't have the same speed factor that Naganadel has. It's a little bit stronger and doesn't require the use of like it doesn't need, because of a spatial rend, it doesn't need its Z move to actually get kills and then snowball from there. It can just straight up use its, like once it uses its Z move, there's no real prediction required. It can just keep clicking buttons until it gets kills. However, it can be revenged somewhat easily because of the fact that it does have a lot of common, not a lot of common, but Scarf Zern is a common check to it. And its speed isn't that high, so it can kind of be taken advantage of in that case. Shuckle is a Pokemon that enables webs. In general, it's pretty much a worse version of Smeargle, but there is a couple situations where it's better, in which it is taunt immune. So teams that are running taunt but not, well, at least one turn taunt immune because it can run Mental Herb. So teams that are running taunt but not like any sort of hazard removal can actually struggle more against Shuckle than against Smeargle. Also, because it can actually run both webs and stealth rocks, which Smeargle now doesn't do because it's better to prevent people from better from the for Sneasel to prevent them from. Wait, have I been calling it Sneasel? Smeargle, sorry. It's been a long recording session. Okay, whatever. Smeargle. It's better to prevent them from setting up clearing their webs than just to set up both hazards anyway. So, yeah, that's what Shuckle's for. Arceus Grass, a good, decent leech seed stopper, decent sweeper, can leer a bunch of stuff with Fire Blast. It's a decent, just like it hits a lot of different stuff. It beats Primal Kyogre notably, but it also has a lot of problems, mainly Duskmane and a bunch of flying types that like Ho-Oh and that kind of stuff. So it has problems. In general, as a defensive grass type, it's outclassed by Mega Venusaur, and as an offensive Pokemon, it can generally be run better by different Arceus forms. However, it is notable for being an offensive Arceus form that is immune to Leech Seed, which, if you have problems with Ferrothorn, this can be a Pokemon for you. Klefki has seen some usage recently, pretty much as a pair spammer. It can also set up screens and spikes, so it's just an obnoxious Pokemon. It's generally support for Zygarde who want pair spam, and it's just obnoxious. It's also the main reason why I don't think it's that good, and why it's rated so low is because it's an Eviltal / Zern check that both can't really. Okay, it's a check to Eviltal that can't really deal with Eviltal because it's Eviltal is immune to all the dark. As a dark type, it's immune to all the prankster stuff. Um, as such, Klefki actually has pretty much the idea that I've been talking about a lot throughout this entire VR is that there are Pokemon that through typing or whatever it is that they have to check a certain Pokemon, but they cannot because of because whatever limitation they have, and so they then like this role that they should be fulfilling cannot be fulfilled by them. As such, Klefki is a Pokemon that can't really see as much usage because of that. And hmm, Oh right, and it's also like but like other than the fact that yeah, as a trek to those Pokemon, it's generally outclassed by Magearna, but it does provide other utility, and that's why it's used. However, it's also pretty frail. It's kind of set up bait. It also loses to Pedon. So those are the notable things. Mega Mewtwo X, decent balance breaker. However, weakness to Xerneas is huge, and it just isn't as good as it was before because it's also general. Well, depending on what set you're running, it's bait for like Gengar, and then speed tying with that kind of sucks. But generally, you don't run Psychic Stab, so like even if you win the tie, it's not necessarily like you would be able to kill the Mega Gengar. And so while it's cool, it doesn't do enough in the current meta. With a lot of different things being able to stop it pretty easily, depending on what set you run. It's a decent taunt user, so it can stop some things from setting up different hazards and that kind of stuff. However, it just isn't as good in the current meta as it wants to be. It's not as bulky, it's not as strong as it wants to be. And this mainly can be attributed to the fact that its coverage moves are pretty bad for what it wants to do. Chansey, I pretty much talked about this when I was talking about Blissey. The only reason you would ever run it is pretty much that you have a pursuit user, a strong pursuit user that can actually trap the things that it needs to, like Mega Gengar and Gothitelle. So if you're running it alongside like a Lolamuck, or if you're running it alongside Tyranitar, then it's viable. But in general, it's outclassed by Blissey because it can be trapped, and that's a huge thing on stall. Shaman Sky, pretty much just a cheese Pokemon. Good at what it does, which is cheesing, and it has pretty much no defensive utility. Ground immunity, kind of, but it dies to every single common ground coverage run by ground type Pokemon. So it is not that good at at defensive utility, but it's pretty much the only reason you would run it is some variation on cheesing people with Air Slash, Serene Grace Air Slash, with either Z Celebrate, with Scarf, with specs to actually like you only need less hits or whatever it is. It's also notable because it also can Seed Flare down some of its counters. If you run something like Life Orb with like Seed Flare and then Air Slash, if you get the drop, which is 80%, which is you would get it most of the time essentially. Buzzwole is used as a check to different things like non-fire move Primal Groudon, like kind of a fringe check to Duskmane. It's a fringe check to or like a check to E-Killer mainly, but it's too much bait for common stuff like Xerneas and Yveltal to be really truly successful. It can be decent, and it's a not bad defensive Pokemon, but it still is held back by some things. It's strong physical bulk and has some useful resistances, but it cannot be like Arceus Ground, SD Arceus Ground, for example, is stopped pretty hard by Buzzwole, but it's just weak to too many common things to be very, very good. Mega Slowbro, check to Duskmane. It loses to a lot of common special attackers like Yveltal, like Xerneas. And while it is pretty good at what it does, which is beating like E-Killer and strong physical attackers, it's like similar to Buzzwole in that sense. It's also as weak to the special attackers while taking up a Mega slot. So while it is cool and it does some things cool, and it can beat things like Mega Ments and similar Pokemon and Primal Groudon to an extent and Duskmane and that kind of stuff. On the flip side of the spectrum, it loses to almost as many Pokemon on the special side, and that can be problematic for some teams. And so while it does have its niche, which is beating these Pokemon, it also doesn't really have it also isn't as good as other Pokemon that can do similar things that are ranked above it. Garchomp and Mamoswine, pretty much together, they are decent offensive rock setters that can use Z moves to their advantage to somehow set rocks, as well as doing some other role. For example, Garchomp can use SD Z move to bait in and kill different support Arceus forms, while Mamoswine can set rocks as well as use Endeavor and Ice Shard and
or use some sort of tectonic rage to be able to cheese out some kills. And Mamoswine is relatively good because ice ground coverage is quite amazing in Ubers, while Garchomp can use its pretty high speed to actually set rocks. They're both not bad Pokemon, but they're generally outclassed by other stuff above it, like Arceus Fairy. Um, Generally, Arceus Fairy is the biggest comparison since that's what they would be aiming to do, just set rocks and be able to pressure it in some way. Mega Blaziken has been seeing some usage, and it can be good against unprepared teams. However, it's generally a cheese Pokemon and doesn't succeed in a lot of situations unless you're not prepared against it. Stuff like Arceus Ground, stuff like Primal Groudon, even like defensive Primal Kyogre are relatively good at answering a Giratina Origin, for example, and so it has a lot of common answers within the metagame. It's not that good, but it can be a decent cheese Pokemon and can succeed versus offense if you're not prepared. Muckalola, Alolan Muck is not bad on stall as an option to trap Gothitelle and um, Mega Gengar. However, that's pretty much its only use, and it can still lose 50-50s if you like they predict your pursuit and then you like get charmed or whisped or whatever it is, and it's possible you don't even get the trap on them, which is kind of dangerous. It's also like a decent trick to other ghost types like Lunala, but it's like fringe usage on stall is what puts it this high anyway, or like what gives it any sort of niche in Ubers, and that's pretty much to pair it with to allow a Chansey to be on your team, since Chansey is individually, if you don't include trapping, a better Pokemon than Blissey. But Muckalola does have issues in that sense because it doesn't always get the trap, and it is bait for like the majority of the metagame. Like most things just beat it, since it's it gets beaten just by like a lot of stuff, since like Primal Groudon, even stuff like Duskmane isn't really scared of it at all, so it is kind of bad for it. Kyogre, a mon that can see some fringe usage because different choice sets can be used to punish teams that are not that can somehow pressure out Primal Groudon or don't run Primal Groudon, for example. It's strong, however, it's super niche and can only really be used as that. And like for example, spec sets can be pretty good against stall, but like I think there's so much stuff that can be used that's good against stall that Kyogre shouldn't really be your first choice. It's pretty much just to punish teams that are not prepared for it, and not that good, but a niche Pokemon that can be used to punish teams. Similar to Kyurem White, punish teams that are not prepared for it. They're stacking Ice weakness and thinking that Ice isn't a huge typing in Ubers, which granted it's not, but it's a punish Pokemon. It's strong, but also has a lot of defensive issues. It can't break through a lot of the it's not strong enough to break through all of its checks and counters and doesn't really have any sort of setup. So it is hard for it to justify because it doesn't really provide a sweeping role and it doesn't really have any sort of like setup. So not that good. Mewtwo, similar to Mewtwo Y, however, doesn't take up a Mega Slot and it's not as strong. You just run it with Life Orb. It takes a lot more chip. It doesn't hit the same speed tier. In general, the only reason you would run it is you're running Mewtwo Y, or like you want something similar to Mewtwo Y, but you don't have the Mega Slot to run it. So, for example, if you want to run on that specific team, like a Mega Lucario, and then a Mewtwo can be a option to run as a taunt user, but generally not that good. Landorus, another offensive rocker that's similar to Garchomp and Mamoswine, pretty much does the same stuff. It's a little bit worse because it has less utility, or like less defensive utility. It's like pretty 4 times weakness to ice sucks in Ubers in general, because everything runs Ice Beam or something similar. Dawnwing's Necrozma, a TR enabler. It also has a role as a Lunalium Z SR setter, which can be good against stall as well as bulky teams that you just want rocks up. But in general, it's outclassed by Lunala because Lunala is faster and has access to Shatter Shield. And also because it has access to Focus Blast, and that's really the big part.
it's unable to break a lot of the ghost checks and counters in the game because it just doesn't have the coverage available to it that it wants. It is actually able to at least damage Eviltal, but I think it has potential if the metagame continues to go away from checking ghost types. That like if Eviltal becomes the primary ghost check on many teams and stuff like Arceus Dark actually falls out of favor, then Dawnwing's Necrozma could be an option. Arceus Dragon and Mega Latios, similar Pokemon. They essentially have two different restrictions. One is taking up an Arceus form, one is taking up a Mega Slot, and they both are used to be primary Mega Groudon check, or not Mega Groudon, Primal Groudon checks. They can defog or do something like that, like pressure a Groudon in some way. They're both not that good because of the fact that they are complete Zern bait, and that's pretty much it. That's the reason why they aren't successful, because being Zern bait sucks, and that's also a reason why Darkrai isn't good. And okay, Skarmory is a Pokemon that you use as a primary Duskmane check, and that's its only niche in the meta. It really doesn't do anything else. It can kind of pretend to set hazards, but then it's also like one of the most passive Pokemon in the game, in the metagame. So it can check these check Duskmane, but that's all it can do pretty much. Darkrai can be a decent sweeper, but it is drops to Scarf Zern. It doesn't have access to sleep, so it doesn't really have an ability. It's fast, but not fast enough to bypass a lot of the Pokemon like Scarf Zern, like that kind of stuff. And it's just generally outclassed by other sweepers that are stronger and faster and have more coverage options. Arceus Steel is a cool Pokemon that you can use as either CM or SD to as a like a fairy resist, but it also loses to Geozern. It's also generally outclassed by other stuff like SD, Arceus Ground, for example. And so you just generally want other stuff instead of it, but it can be a decent option. Dugtrio can be used as a trapper for different things like Primal Groudon if you want to do that. But it generally isn't strong enough to trap the stuff it wants to, and it's just kind of weak and has no defensive utility, so that kind of sucks. Hydreigon can be used as a decent, kind of similar to Mega Latios and Arceus Dragon, can be used as a offensive check to, well, it can be a check to Groudon, but it's more of an offensive check that doesn't lose to stuff like Duskmane. Not to mention Arceus Dragon and Mega Latios also lose to Duskmane, but it also has, Hydreigon has other problems. It's not really that strong. It's not that fast. It's not really that bulky either, but it has a small niche in the meta, I think, for being able to check Groudon and not lose to Duskmane. Um, and then the last Pokemon here is Pheromosa. Pheromosa just can be a snowball Pokemon. It's similar to Noggin and Adele, but it doesn't require setup. Just like could be a setup, could be a snowball Pokemon, but in general, it's not that good because it also has access to U-turn, which is notable. I did say earlier that U-turn is a very good move in the meta. However, much like Naganadel, it has no defensive utility whatsoever. It dies to like every single form of priority. At least Naganadel has some, or like is bulky enough to live like one priority move. Pheromosa isn't even bulky enough to live a priority move. It will drop to like almost priority moves, like Life Orb, Break, Ray, E-Speed, for example. So it is cool for snowballings in some cases and can get out of hand quickly if you don't deal with it, but most teams are running priority to deal with it, so like that can deal with it, so it's not really that much of an issue for most teams. And that is the end of the Uber's viability rankings. I'm sorry if I got a little bit kind of rambly at the end because it's oh man, I'm kind of tired from doing all this. But I hope you guys enjoyed my Uber's viability rankings part 2, and yeah, well, that's about it. I hope that you guys liked this because I spent a lot of time doing this, and once again, shout outs to Sanjay for being able to
for being able to make this graphic for me. It's quite nice of him to do that, and that's about it. So bye bye.